go. All right, welcome to the Dealan-de podcast. I'm with Fiorella Isabel, and she is a journalist. She's a co-host of Convo Couch, former journalist with RT, and we're just going to have a conversation about the current state of politics globally, global affairs, and just kind of what's going on. I kind of wanted to open up with just often there's just a huge disconnect, I think, between what we're told about the world and what's actually going on. Especially, there's so much propaganda in the U.S. that most people, think, okay, the Putin's bad, he's the aggressor, Russia's bad, U.S. is good. We're out there doing good stuff, and even if some things go wrong here and there, we're doing the right thing. How do you respond to something like that?
Well, I mean, I think that's just very generic, and it's based not on any sort of reality or evidence, just based on convincing a sector of the population in the United States and the West to look the other way while their government commits crimes against humanity, against so many people, and overthrows governments and interferes in democratically elected elections like they've been doing for a really long time in Latin America and throughout the Middle East. And so now that's just what people like to believe, or they like to say, well, I'm not into politics, or I'm this or that, because they're very propagandized and distracted. And it's just not reality. Sure, it makes people feel good, but the truth is actually that the government has lied to both the American people and to the rest of the world for a long time. And especially now, coming up on the 20-year anniversary since the invasion of Iraq, nothing has changed. You really see that they're still using the same playbook to justify their interventionism and to make Americans look the other way, while the war that they're waging on Americans is a war of surveillance, and the war that they're waging on the rest of the world is, of course, imperialism. They're trying to basically have this unilateral hold on how the world functions, and when countries stand up to them, then they vilify said country.
Yeah, so true. And then it seems like we can, looking back, we can say, the war in Iraq was built on a lie. Even further back, the first war in Iraq was built on a lie. The Vietnam War was built on a lie. All these sort of things we can go back and say, oh yeah, we can. But then it's in the moment we seem to say, no, they're telling the truth now.
Yeah. I mean, but it's just what people tell themselves to make themselves feel better, I think.
Yeah. And then looking at what's happening in Ukraine, what most people would say are not paying attention as much, but what do you see happening there right now, the current state of affairs?
Well, what's happening there right now is that the United States is leading the pack with NATO, with the EU, with the UK, and this collective as a whole is waging a proxy war with Russia via Ukraine. And I think the word proxy is diminishing each day because they're becoming more and more blatant about what their intentions are. Several US officials have admitted that the Minsk agreements were never really going to be respected, that they were just buying time to equip Ukraine with military, to train Ukrainian soldiers, and to really basically gather everything they needed. And then the goal was always to break up Russia. They said as much in a 2019 RAND document where they outlined exactly how they would break up Russia. They had a plan of using the Balkans and previous former Soviet states to basically destabilize them and turn them against Russia. And they're trying to do that, of course, in Serbia and in other parts of, Armenia. You have everything that's going on there, and they've been trying to weaponize that against Russia, and they have constantly, of course, tried to get newer neutral states to join NATO. And we can look at Finland and Sweden, and we can look at what they're doing with Ukraine and what they're trying to do with Serbia. And so that is essentially what the plan was. And so the whole idea that Putin was unjustified in the special military operation is not only blatantly false, but all you have to do is go to history to see that that's not the case, that this has been going on for a long time in the Donbass since 2014. People have been getting killed there by Ukrainians themselves. I mean, yes, some of these people were at that point in an area that was controlled by Ukraine. But however, they were ethnically Russian, because when the Soviet Union fell, that doesn't mean that these people lost their culture, who they were, their language, everything. And so the United States has been trying to convince people that, this conflict started in February of last year. And that's obviously not true. We're a year into the conflict, and now more and more people are finding out what the United States did in 2014 via the Maidan coup, which was basically a US CIA-backed operation where Victoria Nuland, Jeffrey Pyatt, State Department hacks went in there and ousted democratically elected leader Yanukovych and placed their own puppet there. They were deeply involved in the elections. You can go back to Burisma and how a lot of the same people in the administration right now were involved in taking money from this oligarch, and Petro Poroshenko was also involved at that time. And they had these uranium deals where they were making tons of money. And of course, Hunter Biden sat on the board of one of these companies, and of Burisma in particular. And so you have all of this coming back, and people want to pretend that has nothing to do with anything. Well, for a long time, the United States has been involved in the affairs of Ukraine. So one could argue that Ukraine stopped being a sovereign nation back in 2014. But even if you don't want to argue that, you can't deny that this began 9 years ago now. So that's what happened. And you can't talk about what's going on now without talking about what happened to lead up to it. And that's the problem in most people's analysis, is that they completely ignore everything that happened prior to just like simplify it, or just to make it, to manipulate the narrative. But the reality is very different. And so what we're seeing now is the tipping point of that moment, where Donbass is fighting back, where Vladimir Putin was even criticized by some Russians for not going in sooner. And so in my opinion, Russians have been very controlled and restricted in their actions. They could have done a lot of things more soon, but they didn't. They've exhausted every level of diplomacy. They tried to avoid this. All they wanted was Ukraine to remain neutral, for NATO to not continue crossing the red lines and expanding eastward. And that just didn't happen. And so for Russia, they see this as an existential war, fighting not just the United States and the NATO collective, but also for themselves, for their lives, for this ability to be Russia as it is now. And also what they see, a lot of them, I don't want to say everybody, but a lot of people in the Donbass that are fighting in this conflict see it as an end to this global hegemony, this one unilateral power, this very Orwellian, very, this fourth industrial revolution, this Davos agenda that seeks to basically make everybody subjugated under one government. And they don't want that. And so that's another bigger issue, but that's what some people feel they're fighting against.
And what you were saying, that it was a move, the global hegemony that Russia was facing. After the fall of Russia, they said that NATO would not move one inch east of German, and then slowly you see it creep over, and then you saw Ukraine, being influenced and becoming a proxy state, so to speak. What was the future looking like for Russia? You were saying it was being destabilized potentially from the inside. What was the plans potentially for Russia that, obviously Putin wanted to thwart?
Well, the plans for Russia that the United States and the West have been looking into is to make Russia another subjugated nation that pretty much does the behest of the United States. Russia has a lot of natural resources, particularly in the Donbass region. There is this thing called black soil. It's very, very rich. It's very good for agriculture. They have several minerals. They have carbon. They have just, it's untapped in a lot of these areas, especially even if you go further into Russia, because Russia is a huge, huge country. And you go further east, there's just so much there that is untapped in natural resources. And basically what the West wanted was to have a very easily manipulated, friendly US government like it's had in Europe. And it just wanted to expand basically Europe into Russia and just take out any sort of Russian relationship with the East, with China, and especially with China, because this is also about China, because China has grown into this superpower above Russia and arguably above the United States. China has lifted people out of poverty. No matter how people want to criticize their government, China has grown tremendously in a short amount of time. So that's the reality. And the United States does not want that relationship between China and Russia, two countries that have been, of course, once again, vilified and attacked by the West for a really long time. And so the plans were to make Russia a part of the controlled European Eurasia aspect. To break it up into parts, essentially, and have different regions controlled by different people. They don't want Russia to remain the Russian Federation as it is this gigantic block of land. They wanted to break it up into ethnic groups of different ethnic states. And this is why they use the whole, well, we support the independence and sovereign right of people. And we know that's entirely false, because the United States, of course, has never supported independence and sovereignty of people, because they coup their governments that don't adhere to the Monroe Doctrine policies that the United States still pushes to this day. So, the sovereignty of the people of Donbass was never respected. Americans can't even find Ukraine on a map, and they definitely didn't even know Ukraine existed really until this last year, where they were told that they needed to support Ukraine and be okay with billions of dollars in taxpayer money to go to this war, this conflict from so far away. Meanwhile, inflation at home, rising costs of gas and energy costs, and just houselessness, complete and total decay in the United States. Obviously, the United States is an advanced country. However, it's going backwards now. Everything is in decay. There isn't an upward mobility, whereas in Russia, that has been entirely just, it started out after the fall of Soviet Union in a really bad position. Many people left Russia. People are coming back and saying, wow, what Putin was able to do is different. The transportation is getting better. Things are improving. Even before the special military operation, everything was improving. It's the lifestyle is going up. And that the opposite is happening in the West. Even if Russia is not as an industrialized country as the United States, that mobility is there. And so the whole point is to break up Russia into all these groups, is to really just subjugate it and use all the resources and just make it part of this whole government that they're trying to really just use to control basically everybody in the world, because we have limited resources and they know this, and the world doesn't have isn't going to be able to support what this lifestyle that the West has been pushing with all of these people without having an ability to control it. So that Russia is basically in the way of that, and so is China. And so now what you're seeing is a fight against that, not just by Russia. Russia is leading the path, but other governments and other people, especially in the global South and Africa, are starting to really push back against the West. In Burkina Faso, you're seeing the French being expelled completely out of the country. You're seeing Africa make connections with Russia, with China, and you're seeing this multipolarity building up for the first time. But before it gets to multipolarity, what's going on now is this bipolarity, where you have the West clinging onto its power, and then you have the East trying to fight back against it, and the global South, because notice Latin America also refuses to send any of its weapons or aid to Ukraine. And that is a very big deal, because that shows that Latin America is not just going to do what the United States wants them to do. And for a long time, they've been under the thumb of the West. But now you're seeing more governments say, well, we want to work with everybody. And it's not even we don't want to work with the United States for most of these countries. It's just we want to work with everybody. We want to be equals. We want to be treated with respect and equity, rather than have a one-way relationship where you get to decide who we talk to, what we do. And so that's why these countries are talking to Russia and China more than anything. It's because they just want to have economic development, because they just want to have an equitable partnership, rather than just be told what they can or cannot do.
Yeah, and you see the U.S. seems to have the big piece in their back pocket is basically a hammer. They're going around the world kind of trying to hammer everybody back into their position,
Right.
and setting up global war. And I think anyone interested in peace in the Ukraine, there was peace agreements in play, or it was from what I understand, it was set up. There was a peace accord potentially going to happen that was thwarted by the West. And for anyone who says they're interested in peace in the Ukraine, what we're facing now is just more and more an ongoing war. It seems like a no-win situation. If in that area, it doesn't seem like Putin's. Putin's got a strong position, and the more weapons we put in there, it just means more death. Is that what you're seeing?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, the more weapons and aid that the United States provides to Ukraine, and that NATO provides to Ukraine, Russia has said, and this was said by the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, the more that Russia is going to have to push into Ukraine. Because for Russia, they're looking at this, okay, well, this was way too close to our border now. You're putting weapons along our border on both ends. This is why Finland and Sweden are so important, because they would completely surround Russia if they became NATO states. And so what Russia has to do then at that point is continue to push westward into Ukraine, and to continue to basically attempt to control Ukraine, because they know that Ukraine is just it's basically just weaponized and used by the West as the excuse to attack Russia. They know that they don't care about Ukraine. If they cared about Ukraine, they wouldn't be fighting Russia to the last Ukrainian, because the United States isn't putting their forces in there. The EU is using some soldiers, via NATO, but you're not really seeing like actual soldiers go in there and fight. You're seeing the United States sink Europe's economy, especially Germany, that really relied heavily on cheap Russian gas. You're seeing all of the EU economy affected by this high cost of energy. So the United States is actually winning, because who are they buying from? They're buying from the United States. And this was the plan all along, by the way. Victoria Nuland said it herself. She said F the EU. And so that they don't care. The United States does not care how many allies they have to sink. This isn't the first time they've sunk their allies. But okay, they're using Europe for the money, and then and of course more weapons. And then they're using Ukraine, which has been the most corrupt country in Europe for a long time, with just corruption, money laundering, prostitution, trafficking, etc. And that was before the special military operation. And of course, now you have you've had for a while, but now it's extremely palatable, is you have the Nazi factions in Ukraine. And so that is not just going to go away if Russia agrees to initially say, well, Zelensky can be in there, and we're just going to keep to ourselves going eastward. But the more the United States gets involved, the more they realize like this isn't going to end here. They're just going to continue to push back no matter how much we say we're going to respect these treaties, because they have never respected these treaties. So to Russia, it's like, well, we can't continue making the same mistake. So now we have to go in further and further to make sure that you are far, far enough away from Russia's borders that you have zero chance of ever being able to try to control Russia. This is a fight, again, for the people of Russia as they exist. They see themselves right now in the world being completely ostracized, completely just blamed. You have athletes, artists that are, they can't compete, they can't perform, they can't do anything. You have literature being burned. You have the Russian people attacked as a whole by the West. Russians can't travel to certain places. If we switch the word Russian with Jewish, we know how badly that would be looked upon by the rest of the world, but because it's Russia, and the West has been programmed to hate Russians from the moment you grow up as a child in the United States. You're programmed to hate Russia. Every movie is the evil guy is Russian. Especially in the 60s, of course, and 50s, with McCarthyism, people were programmed to think Russians were going to bomb them. And that reemerged, of course, recently with what we know was completely fake with a Russiagate in 2015, 2016. And they had this whole thing. And so now that's why you're seeing Crimea be brought up, because they know they can get, some sectors of even the left in the United States to go along with the war and say, well, we just want to respect the sovereignty of Crimea because they want to be a part of Ukraine. Crimea chose to be a part of Russia because, again, they're ethnic Russians. So they decided that, but that's not being respected. What they project and they manipulate and they gaslight and they say, no, if you respect the sovereignty of Crimeans, then you respect that they want to be a part of Ukraine. And only because Ukraine, of course, is their puppet territory. So Ukraine is no more. I mean, Ukraine will never be Ukraine as we knew it before last year. It's just not going to be. It hasn't been for a while, since 2014, but there's just absolutely no way it's going to go back. And so Russia is not going to give up on this. Russia cannot give up on this, or they're done. They're done. So, and the United States says, well, Ukraine must win or NATO falls. Well, there you go. Then you're telling us, and as the German, I believe she was like an MP or one of these German politicians said, we are at war with Russia. She said it herself. So they're admitting that they're at war with Russia. So this is not about protecting Ukrainians or standing with Ukraine. This isn't about that. This is clearly about being at war with Russia.
Yeah, if we really stood with Ukraine, we wouldn't be trying to, turning their country into a dust bowl, basically, destroying that country. If we cared about them, we'd be trying to preserve lives, trying to preserve their, their infrastructure, everything, but we're not. We're decimating it. And then you had Putin, who, at one point wanted to join NATO, and then in 2008 you had Obama laughing at the idea of Russia being the enemy when it was brought up in the debates, presidential debates. But now we're at a place because of Russiagate where we villainize them to the point where they're the new enemy on the block. And now we have the newer enemy of China, which is even more concerning. Here we have a weather balloon that blows over top of the country, and we're ready to go to World War III over it. And at the same time, as the weather balloon comes, this weird issue, now we're scared about them over a balloon. We're putting in something like 3 new bases in the Philippines. Can you talk about what's happening kind of in that theater of China?
So like I said, this whole situation with China, I don't think it's a coincidence. The United States ramps up a war with a lot of people, but right now it seems incredible for a lot of us who understand what's going on with Ukraine and with Russia. So on one end, on one front, the United States is waging this proxy war with Russia via Ukraine, and they're sending billions and billions of dollars in weapons, but really they're sinking and using Europe to do it. So they're like, okay, that's fine. And then on the other end, you have China. China is behind Russia. China and Russia are not going to have some sort of breakup. They're not going to be convinced or turned against each other. They recently had a meeting, the Chinese and Russian counterparts, the foreign ministers, and they have cemented their relationship as a relationship that's going to continue growing and that's going to continue to develop. And that relationship, of course, is not just an economic relationship, it's a political relationship. It's a political relationship because they are both vilified intensively by the United States. And that bond is growing with many other countries that have also been vilified and subjugated by the United States in the African continent and in the Latin American continent and in the Middle East or West Asia, like Iran. And we saw what just happened with Iran, where they were bombed by Israel. Israel is, of course, the United States' main partner, but they don't have terrible relations with Russia either. Russia has been instrumental in maintaining peace in the region because of they have some sort of a alliance with Iran. They also have good relations with Syria's government of Bashar al-Assad, and they're working to defeat the terrorist factions there as well. And so you have this whole situation happening. But I think at one point, Russia's going to have to decide who they're going to be align with more, and it's not going to be Israel, because Israel is basically the United States' extension in the Middle East. And so what you're seeing here is more lines being defined here in terms of a potential world war, because now you have multiple layers of multiple conflicts that are all part of the same conflict. Because if you really think about it, what's going on with China, what's going on with Russia is two sides of really the bigger picture, which is the fight of unilateralism and this one world hegemonic attempt for control versus countries that do want to remain independent and sovereign and be able to have just an equitable relationship of multipolarity with each other. You're also seeing the growth of BRICS, and you saw Brazil get back into CELAC, and that's a big deal because CELAC excludes the United States and Canada. And you're seeing these countries in Latin America say that they want to work with everybody. And so you have an emerging multipolar world and the old unilateral world trying to maintain its grip. And that's why you're seeing this conflict with China, because now it's like, okay, well, if we can't get all of the country to join us on Russia, because you saw many Republicans start speaking out against sending weapons to Ukraine. Well, the moment Ukraine changed to, hey, we need to send money to Taiwan and do military drills because China this and China that. Well, they were ready to do that. All of the money that they were complaining about sending to Ukraine, they have zero problem sending it to fight China, because China is, again, it's based on the ideology of communism when we're talking about this fear that a lot of Americans have been bred to have. But it's not even about communism. This is about, this is about exerting control over these countries. They use, of course, the specter of communism in China. They use the specter of the Soviet Union that hasn't existed in Russia for a long time. Russia is a capitalist country. China works strongly in the capitalist world. I wouldn't say it's a full-on communist country at all either. But it's just, you have that specter, and that's also what's used to control the right, because the right, it really just is afraid that communism will come in and control the United States, even though the United States is a capitalist country, and you have the United States operating at this level where its own government is screwing the people. So it just doesn't make sense to blame any outside forces. I mean, this is done by its own government. And so it works really well when you use the specter of China to really instill fear on one end of the political spectrum, and then use the specter of Russia to instill fear in the other end of the political spectrum. So what you have is just on one way or another, you have Americans supporting one conflict or the other. And when it comes to China, Joe Biden is not pro-China in any way, shape, or form. Let's remind everybody that under his administration, Nancy Pelosi went to Taiwan. In spite of the fact she was told not to go, then more delegations came to Taiwan. They're doing military drills in Taiwan. China has said that the United States is really crossing so many lines here, and they have said that the United States is supposedly the United States supports the one China policy. This is something that the Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, has said, we support the one China policy, but they only do so on paper, because when it comes to their actions, they are clearly not supporting this. And they are talking about, they're doing military drills in Taipei. They're continuing to fund more weapons to Taiwan. And that doesn't signal to me, and what you mentioned in the Philippines, and it just doesn't signal to me a respecting of considering Taiwan a part of China, which is what the one China policy includes. And so what's going on now is an attempt to really refocus now on China, because they know that this conflict is really lost when it comes to Ukraine. They're not going to say it outright, but they know like that, this is something that it's going to be difficult for them to win. But if they can get now China involved in this, and if they can sort of maneuver everything into China, then of course, the world is really going to perhaps be more involved in that Americans are going to say, okay, well, there's a Chinese spy balloon in our territory, we need to knock it down. And that's exactly what happened. The other side of the aisle got on board and said, hey, we need to knock down this balloon. And they used an F-16, I believe, fighter jet to literally like knock this balloon down. That's insane. It's a balloon. And they have spent the last week talking about this balloon. Every mainstream media outlet, not just Fox, CNN, MSNBC, they're all in agreement when it comes to this this whole anti-China rhetoric. So yeah, like this isn't a Democrat or Republican issue. War is an American pastime. It's part of what our government has been doing for a long time. And people really need to stop looking at like the Democrat Republican. It's the entire entity of the United States is run by the national security state apparatus and the State Department. Joe Biden is just a figurehead as president. We know Joe Biden isn't even apt to make any decisions. So he's not running the show here. And people need to understand that Joe Biden is just, he's not running the show. So the State Department is running the show. And there are a lot of people that are extremely just disturbed, that think that if we just go and continue pushing and perhaps nuclear, instigate here or there, these countries are just not going to respond. And of course, that could potentially either send us into extreme chaos or end the world, because these are nuclear countries we're talking about here, with Russia, with China, Iran. And right now, we are the closest we've ever been to a World War III nuclear war disaster than we've been even before the Cold War. So
yeah, and it seems like that's the only playbook that they have in front of them is continued escalation of war, continued aggression abroad, continue to push other powers like China or Russia towards getting in line, and if they don't, it's going to appear that they're the provokers. And like you said, that both parties are fully in line with the war machine, fully in line with the corporate power, system that we have in place. And Wall Street is pushed by war. That's where they're making their money now, is the escalation of arms sales and escalation of military. And then where you said that the communism is seen as the threat. Well, now it's just plain socialism is seen as an evil. That they condemn that. The House condemned socialism, where half the Democrats agreed with that. That yeah, socialism was the great evil now.
Yeah, and I think that's funny.
Which is just like taking care of people. Yeah,
Yeah.
Taking care of the everyday people is now the threat. But yeah, we don't have well, and so back home here, there's not really any anti-war movement, and there's certainly nothing on the left. There's been a right-wing populism that's sort of allowed or that is vocal, but you don't see any sort of left socialist side that's been strong ever since Bernie kind of collapsed and acquiesced. What are you seeing there?
Oh yeah, I mean, I lived through all that. I mean, the left has been co-opted for a long time. It started, of course, during the civil rights movement. After the civil rights movement, the groups that were anti-war, because then we did have an anti-war left at that moment. But the left of the civil rights movement was anti-war. They talked about foreign policy. They were anti-capitalist. A lot of them. You had the Black Panthers. You had Malcolm X, Fred Hampton. You had people talking about socialism. You had socialist parties in the United States. You had the influence of that thought process, that ideology, which basically just meant in the United States, workers' rights and making sure you earn enough money to put your family, your kids through school, and to have, a decent life and save for retirement and buy a house. That's all it basically meant. It was never anything more than that. It was not a one world government. It was not anything that the people have been propagandized to think that's what it is. And slowly that was eaten away, of course, via the next several installations of the CIA was definitely involved in that, and controlling elections. We don't have fair elections in the United States, and it would take a whole other episode for me to talk about why we don't have fair elections, but we don't have fair elections in the United States. And America long stopped being a republic. The last few presidents that actually spoke out against that, or the last few politicians, were assassinated or ousted. We can go back to JFK and him saying he wanted to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces. And of course, meeting with Castro, or attempting to have talks with Castro, and attempting to stop a potential nuclear war. And of course, now there's more and more information coming out that, he was assassinated by the CIA, and all of our biggest activists were assassinated by the FBI. So then you can really figure out what's going on here, is that anybody that opposes the national security state apparatus is really a danger. Not opposes, a certain politician or this or that, but opposes the actual people that control the political world and the foreign policy aspect of the United States. Because what America needs to realize is that our foreign policy is our domestic policy. We've brought the war home in the sense of the surveillance state. We've brought it home through the police, the fact that police are oftentimes trained by the military. They are militarily equipped. You go to, for any other country, you will not see police armed the way they are in the United States. And I've been to several countries, and the police are nowhere near armed the way they are armed in our country. It's just absolutely ridiculous. And so you have a left that got co-opted, completely disempowered, basically turned into liberals, the next generation of liberals. And of course, Bernie was used for that. He was, when he refused to challenge Hillary Clinton, when he refused to run independent and talk about what they'd done to him. And this was, of course, supported by WikiLeaks and the revelations that Julian Assange provided. And people just either gave up and became a part of the, the liberal establishment, or they left the Democratic Party. And so you have the few people that left the Democratic Party are either trying to make third parties happen, which third parties don't happen in the United States because there is not an even platform for them to exist. They just don't get the same benefits. So you're not seeing third parties rise in the United States because of that reason. And so then other people just completely just drifted out of politics, realizing that electoralism wasn't the way. And so you have whatever was left of the left has splintered into different groups. And the what is considered left now in the United States is basically just a new type of liberal that is extremely focused on social issues like abortion rights, women's rights, trans rights, gay rights, but has no economic backing to these social issues. So they're just really a name, and allows itself to be carried away by this culture war with the right, which the right is also involved in the culture war on the other aspect, where they are super focused on those things, on the woke culture. So it's this woke and anti-woke fighting each other, but really nobody's really attacking the economic aspect. As you mentioned, there was an emergence of the populist right because of Donald Trump. But at the end of the day, Donald Trump filled his whole cabinet with the swamp. He filled it with just ex-CIA assets. He completely had Pompeo in there. He's had just terrible, very neocon hawkish type of politicians in his cabinet. And he also has played along with so many of the psyops. So he didn't really challenge the status quo, as people like to think. He was just simply uncouth in comparison to somebody like Obama, who was a great orator and would just eloquently state, things or not say outright, we're going to take your oil. So that's why Trump wasn't liked, because by the establishment as much, because he was just saying things, the quiet part out loud. And I don't think he's necessarily a status quo politician like the others have been, but is he really, fighting the globalists? I don't think so. I think he has also been a tool, because without Trump, we wouldn't have Biden. Without this fear mongering that Trump is this fascist, this Nazi, white supremacist, blah, 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 people wouldn't have allowed themselves to be fooled that Joe Biden, a guy who couldn't fit a room and had zero support, was in fifth place, is now president, and Kamala Harris, who couldn't even win her district, is also vice president. So again, 2020 showed us how easily manipulated our elections are, with one phone call from Barack Obama. And of course, with the fact that people don't question their election system that's controlled by it's a closed system. We don't get to see a public counting like we do in other countries. We don't get to really have just an inclusive system. We vote on a Tuesday, or now you can vote for a whole month and vote by mail ballots, which completely were outlawed in many countries because they're not. There's not a system to justify them in the United States. There's no tracking. There's nothing. So then you have, of course, what emerged was Trump supporters saying that they were cheated in the election, and they went and they were the only people. They did what the Bernie supporters failed to do. They went into the Capitol and went in there and said, "Hey, we don't support this." And instead of saying, "Hey, we should have done this," the left was like, "Oh my God, you need to go and get the FBI on all these people." So then they started turning into FBI chuds on the left, and of course, then you had COVID. And everything just came together to make the left basically just completely unfanged. It's completely unfanged. It's completely now supporting the national security state apparatus. It's supporting the establishment. It's supporting the same things they used to hate. I mean, a few years ago, the left was the one that was questioning vaccines. The left was the one that was talking about free speech. The left was the one that was anti-war. Now that's been flipped, and the only people opposing that a lot of the times are on the right, and maybe not for the right reasons, but it's still there. It's still happening. And so no, there is no left in the United States. I mean, that's not left, in my opinion, as to what I consider the left, but that's what is known as left in the United States. The Squad, AOC, they vote the same way as Nancy Pelosi. So what's the difference essentially in electing them? Oh, they're just intersectional. Congratulations. Now we have, intersectional imperialists in Congress rather than the usual white imperialists. Why does that even matter at this point when you have them voting the same way? And so that's where we're at. And I think like the left is completely done in the United States, but the only thing that can save the United States, perhaps not save it, but at least garner some sort of pushback against its the war criminals that control it, is a united United States of people from all ideologies. I think that is what can only defeat this establishment that is pretty much just trying to control the rest of the world, and is waging war on the rest of the world, because they're waging war on us too. They're dividing us. They are trying to turn working people against each other, trying to blame, this Trump supporter for this other supporter for that and that. At the end of the day, really, the American people have more in common with each other than they do with these politicians. And they need to realize that. They need to put that aside. They need to put the fact of whether they label themselves a libertarian, a socialist, a this or that, understand who really is the enemy. Because if you want to argue about ideology, we're not going to be able to do that when we have a world that's controlled by all these war criminals and fascists. You're not going to have the opportunity to do that. So I think the United States is where the people of the United States are the number ones that have to push back against this, because it is our government doing this with our money, on our behalf. You're basically condoning it, even if you're not participating in it. And so it has to come from them. And what I'm seeing still on the left is people getting mad. Oh, so and so is doing the Rage Against the Machine anti-war rally, but I don't like this person because they're bad and blah blah blah. And it's like, well, I don't have to like everybody on that stage, but this is about stopping nuclear war and calling for an end to U.S. funding of the Ukraine war. So is that more important perhaps than the fact that they may have some speakers you don't like and you may be right in not liking them or whatever the hell that is? But at the end of the day, what's more important, and what I'm seeing on these sectors of the left is they want to decide who is worthy and who is not, and that's just not going to fly, because at least this attempt is an attempt to unite different factions to speak out against war. And that's something that we really do need in the United States. It's something that is absolutely necessary at this time, especially, of course, with the US trying to start war now with China and really escalating already tense tensions with China.
Yeah, I think we live in a bit of a delusional idea that, like the idea of World War III and nuclear war is kind of like it's a fantasy world that we're not realizing is actually the real world, a real world threat. The idea of any kind of nuclear war, and we're sort of one false flag or one terrorist attack or one something happening on American soil towards the whole galvanizing for World War III. So the idea of anybody who's against that, who cares where you stand on any other issue? If in this issue you're anti-war, if on this issue you're against World War III and nuclear war, come out and let's stand together. It makes sense, So, and are you participating in that rally, or what is?
No, I'm in Moscow,
Okay.
So no, but a lot of my
Yeah.
friends. A lot of my friends are participating in the rally. So, I mean, I recommend people definitely watch and see. A lot of people are participating in it. And I think it's important, to do so because I don't see, and this is what I tell the left that gets mad that they don't like, all these speakers or whatever. Make your own rally. I mean, nobody's stopping you from making this rally. If you don't like the libertarians and whatever,
if you don't like
make your own rally.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we have, the everyday citizen in the United States has more in common with the Russian citizen than we do our own politician. I think that's one thing we don't realize, that you're in Moscow, the everyday person in Moscow, their concerns, their issues are the same as ours. We just want a world where we can all just do well. We can all, have some level of and not be a part of this.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people need to remember that, people think Russians are some sort of like other alien life. Like they're human beings just like everybody else. They go to the park, they go hang out with their families, they go to restaurants, they go to bars, they go shopping. Like it's the same thing here. They listen to American music. I mean, it's really crazy when people lose their humanity when it comes to these conflicts, because they completely don't realize like these are just people on the other side. They just happen to be born in Russia, and they happen to be, of course, I think on the other side, they're more aware of what the reality is than we are in the United States. And that's just because, the people of Russia have endured so much suffering for a long time. And I think that's still seen. However, I do think that the younger generations of people in Russia are more Western friendly than the older generations who were part of the Soviet era. And I definitely seen that and experienced that. And I try to tell them, like, the West is not what TikTok or Snapchat or all these social media platforms that the intelligence apparatus is trying to get people sucked into, because that's exactly how you convince younger people. And when you're young, obviously, you tend to have a rebellious nature against your own government and against your own authority. So it makes sense that, some people say, well, Putin should legalize marijuana, or Putin should be more gay friendly, or Putin should this and that. And, if Russian people want to do that, that's fine. But to have outside forces come in and try to manipulate that is what the United States does. They try to do it in Iran as well, with these support of women's rights. which of course you support women's rights by bombing them, by destroying their economies and their government, and sending in basically a group of more extreme extremist ideologies. That's how you support women, and that's how the United States has supported women throughout the Middle East, by supporting Al-Qaeda, supporting these groups, and then turning around and saying, oh well, these they need our help. And this is what they do. And people need to be aware of color revolutions. They need to look back in history as to what was going on in Iran is an attempt at a color revolution that's been done before many times throughout history by the United States. And it's just, they get all of NATO to do it. They get all of mainstream media to support it. And they put it on these social media platforms where young people go and they're all like, oh my God, we need to stand with Iran and women and blah, blah, blah. So this is sort of what Russia is fighting. Like, they're fighting this idea that other countries can't decide for themselves. This is, at the end of the day, it's all about sovereignty, of respecting people's sovereignty, really respecting it, not saying you respect it because they're against, the country or government you want to control, but actually respecting people's choices and who they are, and the fact that they want to be equals on the geopolitical world, and have this ability to just live in a world where everybody trades, because if you, through cooperation, more people benefit. It's that simple. But this is, I think this is why this is such an existential fight right now. It's so much bigger than Russia. It's so much bigger than Putin. It's so much bigger than Ukraine. It's bigger than everything. And I think there is a right and wrong to this whole situation. The United States needs to stop being the world police, needs to stop trying to control everybody else, and Europe and need to stop doing their bidding, because that's exactly what continues to happen. And the people of these countries, of Europe, of the West, of the United States, need to really rise up. I see it in Europe all the time. They're protesting sanctions against Russia. They're protesting NATO. We don't have that in the United States because the people of the United States are so propagandized. And so the moment we start having it, it gets criticized, it gets thwarted. So that's what you're seeing right now, an attempt in the United States to do something against that, to push back and say, hey, we're against war. We're going to have some of our speakers who have been, you have Scott Ritter, former UN weapons inspector for Iraq. And then, of course, you have people saying, oh, but he shouldn't speak, and this and that and all that. But it's just like, that's what stops the United States, this whole political attempt to fight each other rather than look up as to who you really should be fighting. Russians aren't your enemy. Chinese people aren't your enemy. Iranians aren't your enemy. Your enemy is at home. Your enemy is in your government. Your enemy are your politicians that aren't doing anything about the housing crisis, that more and more people are becoming homeless every single day. You don't have healthcare. You don't have any of these things that some of the countries like Russia have. They have healthcare. They have free public education. You don't have that. You have a nation in debt. You have generations completely just lost. They don't know anything political because they're so distracted by having to work or being under debt or being distracted by just the entertainment industry in Hollywood that's used to distract and propagandize people. So that is essentially what the other side is fighting. They don't want that. They don't want that to be the norm. And that's why it's such a huge deal that we pay attention and we educate people with shows like this and with other types of platforms, and just continue doing it. And I think for me personally, my next really attempt is going to really try to figure out ways to get to really young people who have the attention span of a goldfish, because I have a younger sibling, and I know that they don't really pay attention to podcasts as much. They look at, TikTok and like really small videos, and it's really hard to get on those platforms because they do censor you. So that's another thing we're dealing with, is the fact that like for example, RT is censored anywhere in Europe. It's censored in the United States. We get censored on Twitter. We get labeled on Twitter. So it's a lot we're fighting. But I think the more and more people do it, it's just going to be harder for them to control, because the internet is a tool that's used both ways. It can be used for good and it can be used for bad. And right now it's being controlled by really bad people. But I think the more people we get on our side, the more we can find ways to counter that.
Yeah, and I think that the vacuum between what everyday people want and the reality they're having to confront is getting greater and greater and greater. And at some point, nature imparts a vacuum, and it's going to collapse on some level, whether politicians stand on our side or not. But and the young people are kind of facing that. Hey, I want to thank you for your time. I know we just had a bit of time with you. You gave us a ton of stuff here. How can people find you and stay in touch with what you're doing?
Right. So I have my YouTube show with Pasta called the Convo Couch. I'm also on Twitter at Fiorella Isabel M on Twitter, and you might have a hard time finding me if you're in the United States, but if you put a different country, you'll be able to find me. And then I also am on RT. I'm a correspondent, and I'm also an anchor on RT. So I do the news, and I'm there. It really depends, but I'll be there in a few days back again. So if you go to rt.com, or you'll be able to watch RT on Rumble, Odyssey, or Gab, which is another platform. So you can find me on there as well. So thank you very much for having me on and for the discussion.
Yeah, thank you for your time. I appreciate it.